Thank you, Cameron. I'll just introduce myself briefly. Like I said earlier, I head the American Business Council in Nigeria, but my past life is I worked with a pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, actually, for over 7 years or so, and I still do a lot of work with patient groups. So this is me in a nutshell. But on a lighter note, sometimes you have to be careful with the kind of words you use when you want to present, and that's the word labyrinth. I was coming in on Saturday, and I'd never seen the kind of long winding queues I saw at the immigration point, for non-EUs. It was long and very winding, and then you had long faces of people. You had people, on wheelchairs. I got in at 7:07 and left the airport at about 9:09. And so that brought the imagery of the issue of the challenges and the complexities around access in developing countries, in the recipient communities, as she rightly noted. So, of course, we know that when we're talking of access, we're talking about means and we're talking about opportunities, and not just means in terms of affordability, but also means in terms of knowledge, means in terms of information and ability to get this as well. And so before we talk about access in developing countries, I believe that we need to look at issues around not just access to medicine, but access to healthcare. Because is it going to be one or the other? Is it going to be the chicken or the egg or both? It's very important that we look at them together and not just one before the other. And the reality is that access comes within the ambit of a lot of issues. One of these critical issues is a politics. She talked about the social network things, even at the community level, but even when you move from community to even areas or the spheres higher than the community level, you see politics, playing a critical role in access in most of those countries. So you find out, the lip service that government plays, to issues around healthcare. I'm sure a lot of us know about the issue on the Abuja Declaration. You talked about the London Declaration. There is the Abuja Declaration of 50%, allotted of budget allotted to healthcare in Africa, and most of this we are still at single digits, some as low as about 4-5% in Nigeria. So when we talk about the healthcare issues, we find out that usually you have healthcare projects, increasing towards the beginning of an election cycle. So it will be an interesting study in this room for us to consider how healthcare projects, spring up and increase just as you're getting towards election year, and after that, it kind of dips again. And perhaps that will tell how you need to engage governments when it comes to issues around access. So again, we're talking of infrastructural issues as well. There are critical infrastructural challenges. And then, of course, during this political period, or at least during the pre-political campaign or the political campaign areas, you find governments promising healthcare workers increase in salaries and all that, which eventually poses itself a challenge after the elections. And then, of course, there is apathy to access initiatives, what the president of Rwanda will call, the babysitting mentality. So we have the babysitting access strategies of donations that are not sustainable, So, and then of course there are issues around accountability of, for monitoring. So you provide these medicines, like when we were running a trachoma initiative in Nigeria. I remember that, in some cases we found that the medicines were going to the private market, and somehow, the controls were not there. Same thing in Tanzania. The Tanzanian government did not give a feedback to Pfizer, so Pfizer stopped, the donation for some time. So these are some of the things you see. Of course, you have the socioeconomic issues, we have the strikes. Now, even if you provide all the medicines and then the healthcare workers are not there, what's going to happen? And then we are beginning to find out that even the regulatory agencies are also going on strike. So these in critical countries, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Nigeria, these things are beginning to unfold. And unless these issues are really looked at, and the issue of an unhappy workforce, then we're not going to resolve the issues around access. Now, of course, we have the healthcare workers who are struggling. Who is the most important? Is it are they the nurses, or are they the doctors, or the health workers? And you find out that when the doctors end their strike, the nurses start their strike, and then it goes on and on and on, and people are dying. So these are realities. And so, of course, we have the issues of the low penetration of the universal healthcare coverage, and then you have, or even the issues around the sustainable, Danny talked about the sustainable projects. I was part of the Ghana Access and Affordability Project recently with Bill and Melinda Gates and Pfizer, Sanofi, MSD. I recall that we wanted to use one of the largest hospitals in Ghana, and we did not get the cooperation of the stakeholders, and we had to begin to think of alternatives. So these are some of the things you see. Of course, we talk about the issues around brain drain, because of course people are not happy with their salaries, so they begin to move to developed countries, and so you have we don't have enough healthcare workers, and then of course that increases or reduces the contact with patients, and then they're not patient enough to get enough information, and then we don't get enough data to work, and so it just keeps going on and on. So we've talked about the issue of religion, and I don't want to talk about that again. But again, if you look at an NTD, leprosy, for instance, there is a deity that is said to inflict things like smallpox and related issues, called the deity in one of the ethnic groups is in Nigeria, that has really impacted even in the Caribbeans. It's like the deity called Shopono. And because of that, it's like, oh my goodness, if something happens to you, then it means that it's an infliction from this deity. So what then? Are you going to come out to say, yeah, this is me, I'm a patient that survived X, Y, Z? So this could be a challenge as well, because, for instance, we had HIV patients, that came out to say, okay, this was our challenge, and this is me, I'm a survivor, and things like that. Some of these cultural challenges, even sickle cell as well, people believe that these are children who come and die, and all that. So cultural challenges remain critical, but interestingly, the same cultural nuances can really be used to improve access, depending on how these are resolved. So again, we've talked about this, that there's real need to go beyond, philanthropy, or even the minimal cost access, or even issues around differential, pricing. We really need to include the patient groups to get them to drive the engine of access. The glaucoma is an NCD, it's not an NTD. But there was a project that that I saw as an opportunity that patient groups that companies can use, and that's a lot more sustainable. I started this with a handful of patient groups and within a tertiary hospital in Lagos, and the group grew from about 10, through things like awareness and a lot of things. Just to cut the long story short, they grew to like 200, and they actually began to ask for access to one of Pfizer's medicine, to negotiate. They began to have the power to negotiate, and of course there were other companies like Guinness that funded related issues around health, around glaucoma, and then there was also an opportunity for them to fund them in a sense. Point is, the patients begin to grow and begin to get empowered to ask questions and to ask for lower prices, good quality medicines, and there are ways you can really work around this complexities, but ways that you can get this off the ground to get them to get, you know, their medicines, and then to work with, I don't know if how many of us know Jumia. Jumia is an online online company, and so we reached out to them, you know, and they agreed they were going to support in terms of getting the medicine to the patient group on their meeting days. So again, the emphasis on community life, the emphasis of using what is important to you know, groups to drive to drive opportunities around sustainable access. Imagine if you begin to have such groups like cells cutting across different institutions, different healthcare centers, and, you know, knowing, you know, what they can do and how they can get, you know, the medications across. It could be an interesting way to ensure that on the ground there is sustainability as well. So just to say, moving forward, we need to explore a lot more multi-sectoral synergies. So it's not just the consortium of pharma companies coming together, but you will be surprised that, at least for instance, in Nigeria, or even in Africa, there may be a need for us to have alternative power organizations, IT companies, you know, that, you know, want to support access initiatives, and then you have to adopt a more appropriate cultural type access that will have that will be relevant to the environment. We have to shift from the babysitting models of access, you know, being, you know, passive recipients of donation, to active partners, and more sustainable access model with pharma and diagnostic companies. And the governments must have the commitment to effectively monitor and support access projects, and they should also be able to enforce counterfeit laws that glean access supply chains and glean access supply chains of counterfeits. Because when we're talking about access, and at the end of the day, people are also getting medicines that are not, you know, the right medicines. It becomes a critical issue. But overall, there is a need to get patient groups, you know, very involved, you know, from the point of concept to the point of execution. Thank you.